Welcome to the 2024 ICRRA conference, Decolonial Practices in International Cultural Relations, Building Trust. We are delighted to have you with us for this session, which is a panel discussion titled Questioning Relational Paradigm of Exchange. This is one of the 4 online sessions and the last one taking place as a part of the conference. Hopefully you have already been able to join the other sessions, which we refer to here in the chat. Let me first introduce myself. I'm Anita Budziszewska. I'm working at the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies of the University of Warsaw, and I'm a member of ICRRA network. ICRRA stands for the International Cultural Relations Research Alliance. So before I will introduce our panelists, let me say a little bit about ICRRA and our overall aims for this conference. The ICRRA network brings together global research and insights on the theory and practice of international cultural relations. When we talk about the cultural relations, we are really talking about ways of working internationally in the areas of arts, education, and civil society to build trust and understanding, to promote collaboration, and to enhance and sustain dialogue between people and cultures. However, international cultural diplomacy is still largely carried out with the help of infrastructures shaped by the legacies of European overseas colonialism. And if we hope to develop more inclusive and representative frameworks for our field, historical reflections is essential as a practices of learning. With this conference, we aim to bring together different perspectives and provide a critical conversation on current post-colonial approaches and decolonial practices in the field. In doing so, we will question the status quo in frameworks of the international policies, while providing a space for re-examination and reflection of who decides which epistemologies shape the discourse. We do not wish the conference to be all-encompassing, but a laboratory, a place for dialogue, and a starting point for various processes and actions. We're glad to have you on the board and to be part of these discussions. Please do post your questions, comments, and reflections in the chat as we go along, and we'll aim to cover as many of these as we can at the end of the session. On today's session, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We start from Professor Senayon Olaoluwa, Professor of Diaspora and Transnational Studies. More about our guest. Professor Senayon Olaoluwa is the pioneer coordinator of Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ibadan, Nigeria, and the founding director of the TED Fund Center for Excellence for Diaspora Studies. He will be talking about the festivals as the relational paradigms for negotiating cultural complexities, and he'll bring the example of from Nigeria and Germany. Then we give the floor to our other guest, Professor Shadra Teriya-Ukuma, lecturer of cultural performance and sustainability. Professor Ukuma is a university lecturer at Benue State University in Nigeria. He will be talking about the cultural value of nostalgia towards achieving migration equity. And last but not least, we have here with us Professor Luis Javier Capote Perez, civil law lecturer. Professor Perez is a civil law lecturer at the University of La Laguna, Spain. He will be talking about the mark law and the cultural heritage, the Hakuna Matata case. As far as the structure of the panel is concerned, we'll now give the floor to our panelists for about 10 minutes presentations, and then we're gonna organize Q&A session. Professor Olaoluwa, it's my pleasure to welcome you again. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Is it possible to share my slide from that end for me? Okay, great. A little mix up in that introduction anyway, Anita, but it doesn't matter now. Here is my the topic I am presenting this paper on. Sorry, I have a cold. I'm trying to get better. So on the cultural value of extagia towards achieving international migration equity, I have adjusted the topic a bit. The question that comes to mind is, what is this thing called extagia? Extagia is my coinage that I use to describe, as it were, a peculiar form of suffering, a peculiar form of creativity, simultaneously associated with the left behind in the context of international migration. It also applies to other forms, of migration. To the next slide, please. I am conscious of the fact that we have a very short time, but understanding nostalgia, extagia may begin with first the history of extagia, the history of nostalgia. Nostalgia itself was coined in the late 17th century, precisely 1688, by a Swiss medical scholar who had to investigate the mysterious death of Swiss soldiers sent abroad, to fight. And at the end of his study, he found out that those soldiers were not dying out of combat, they were dying on account of some form of grief that overwhelmed them on the basis of their not being at home. So nostalgia originally was utilized as a medical term before it became a word so well received in social science and humanistic scholarship, whereby we just reference it as homesickness. Now, my argument in this presentation is that just as those who depart from the homeland are affected by not being at home, those who leave behind in the context of migration, international or not, are also affected. There is an affective deficit that is created when we leave our loved ones behind. To the next slide. Now, that is what I now call extagia. Now, to understand again extagia, we must begin with how Johannes Hofer, the Swiss medical scholar, came up with the invention or the coinage of nostalgia. It was a combination of two Greek words, nostro and argos. Nostro means home, homeland, argos, grief. So in my own case, I have coined extagia from the whole idea of exodus, exit, and argos, so meaning a form of grief that is predicated, as it were, on the dispersal of, in scholarship generally, especially in migration scholarship, we have tended to generally placed attention almost exclusively on the suffering and the grief of those who migrate and migrant lives generally. In literature, in sociology and all that, you want to talk about sociology of migration, sociology, or literature of migration, anthropology of migration, and it goes on and on and on. People hardly talk about the anthropology of the left behind. And yet, in doing that, we have created an affective deficit which needs to be addressed. To the next slide, please. Now, how then is this addressed? That is why I have said it is then necessary that in addressing the disequilibrium to the valuation of this dispersal from homeland as a spectrum, I argue that a composite understanding of the experience of exile or migration generally tends to be enriched when we begin to acknowledge the constitutive the constitutive grief of the left behind. Back to that slide in English, please. And yes, because the suffering and creativity of the left behind in the homeland, and which are predicated on the dispersal of their loved ones into other lands, also constitute what I have termed extagia. An initial reflection on this theory was published last year in Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies published by the University of Toronto Press. Now to the next slide, where I'll be able to explain a little better. Next slide, please. I know our time. Now, this is the cultural dimension to extagia. The theory itself was, for me, inspired by an ogu-cultural practice among this minority group in southwest Nigeria and part of the Republic of Benin. What do? It is about the hierarchy of values. Twin children are considered to be highly valued. In case any one of them dies, the entire community comes together and decide that something has to be done. That thing they do is to carve an effigy to represent the dead child and then deny the fact that the child is dead. And when they do that, the mother of the child becomes an embodiment of what I call simultaneous grief and creativity. So that the symbol of the dead child, which the people say is not dead, but has only proceeded on a journey, stands to tell us that, first, those related to the twin child need to be comforted. Two, that process of comforting them is also a demonstration of transcendence, so that the people left behind, the moment we take seriously the fact that the cultural symbol can be used in framing our understanding of extagia, it then tells us that the people we leave behind in the context of international migration also need to be catered for. We need a system of care. We need support system, just the way the European Union, the Red Cross, the United Nations, do a lot to protect migrant lives, migrants and all over the place, simply because they are not at home. Because we identify them as a vulnerable category. It is in the same way we need to begin to consider the various ways in which those loved ones we leave behind in the homeland constitute a vulnerable category that we need to cater for. To the next, all right. So I am trying to round off because I'm conscious of the time. So the necessity of that support system for the left behind, can be understood from various angles. For instance, from the angle of what I call the convergent import of global health, public health, and One Health for the left behind. The idea of global health, for instance, is that no one should be left behind. Is that correct? Now, the question is, when we then pay so much attention to the lives of migrant individuals and groups, and in the process of it, forget that their being away, their exit from home also affects the people they leave behind, then we are not quite taking seriously, that tripartite, understanding of global health, public health, and One Health. It might interest you, for instance, to know that shortly after I published this first work on extagia, IMO has now instituted a new project called Missing Migrants Project. The Missing Migrant Project is not about the migrants, but about their loved ones who are disturbed and grieved and go everywhere looking for them. That is an illustration of how we have, over the years, paid so much attention to those who go away without considering how they are going away affects the people they leave behind. And so this is one import of a cultural practice that can help us to begin to reimagine what I call the migration cycle. Back to the slide, please. Yes. So we need to consider that. And the next thing is what I call, so the need to reconfigure what we call the migration cycle to include the left behind and consider them to be integral members of the migration cycle. Now, the urgency of seeking migration equity by using the Ogun-symbolic culture model for instituting structures and systems of care for the left behind. The moment we acknowledge the fact that the way we care for migrant lives, the way we talk about their nostalgia, the way we talk about their depression, the way we talk about their mental health has become exactly the same way we have to talk about their loved ones that are left behind. Formal and informal structures of care can then be established across the globe to help the people whose loved ones have departed. And this is the centrality of the cultural practice, where the dead child is reconfigured in the imagination of the people as not dead, but on a journey, a firewood fetching journey. And because of that, we have to find a way of curating the absence at home. We have to find a way of grieving the journey, but we also have to find a way of, exhibiting creative steps that are coping strategies for transidence. I'm running up now to the last, the penultimate slide, please. Yes. So I have in that first journal article, in any case, it is actually a book project. What I did was to test the waters with the initial theoretical reflection. And in the conclusion of that paper, I have challenged and invited scholars across various disciplines to begin to consider the various ways in which we can begin to acknowledge the parallel suffering and grief and creativity of the left behind, so that we, just as we concentrate, we pay attention to what happens to those who engage in migration, we also begin to consider what happens to the people they leave behind. And now I'm saying that there is already a very good example of this, of responding positively to this call by me from, the University of Iowa, USA, where a faculty public health, a global public health faculty pilot grant was awarded for a grant that was based on immigration and mental health outcomes among, please, could you go back to it in English? Okay, yeah, immigration and mental health outcomes among left behind families in Ibadan, Nigeria. Now, the interesting thing about this research is that those who constitute the research team won that grant precisely because the theoretical framework was extagia, and it is just one grant per year at the University of Iowa. And the selection committee was like, this is amazing. This is compelling, and I think it deserves, to have this pilot grant, and let's see what we can do with it. And so, from the angle of cultural practice now, we discover that here is a theory that has become something that is productive in medical science to enhance, human life, from the angle of global health, public health, and One Health. Now, I am finally going to say that, so what we can then do is to continue in this approach to begin to look at the various ways in which extagia can resonate in the way we begin to reformulate and reconfigure our systems of care, not only for migrant lives, but also for those left behind. I would like to thank you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Olaoluwa. Also, thank you for keeping the time limits. Your presentation was fantastic, and actually showed and proved how many dimensions have migrations. So we need to just bear in mind that we are talking not about people who are migrating actually, but there's a whole bunch of other groups that need to be taken into account when talking about the migration. So thank you so much. It was really fantastic. Now we smoothly go to another presentation by another speaker, but we still are in the area of migration and now about the more from the theoretical point of view. Professor Ukuma, the floor is yours. Do we have Professor Ukuma with us? Yes.
That's the presentation from Professor Luis Capote Perez.
Yes, but okay. Okay. So now we can just start presentation from Professor Capote Perez. It's okay. Professor Luis, the floor is yours. We're gonna talk about the case study of Hakuna Matata. So Professor Luis, the floor is yours again. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much to the institution and my colleague, but also my good friend, Professor Anita Budziszewska, for the invitation and the opportunity of being here one more time. It's my second time here. And I would like to talk about a case because, well, there's a special one. Can I control the presentation, or otherwise you can manage to change the slides? Okay, thank you. It's interesting because, okay, in this year, 2024, it's the 30th anniversary of the release of this Disney film, The Lion King. And also introduce a very interesting case that we could talk about some aspects of intellectual property law, specifically industrial property law in the Spanish definition, as mark law can affect or could affect some aspects of cultural heritage protections. And we are going to see in one aspect. Next slide, please. Okay. It's because, okay, if you know the film, two characters as Timon and Pumbaa were very popular, and they still are. So many derivative works in the audiovisual market of Disney were with main characters of these characters, and well, they used to use a catchphrase from the Swahili, Hakuna Matata. The translation could be no problem, there is no problem. Asked to have registered as a mark, and they cut the mark in 2003. And okay, then we have a traditional expression from the Swahili culture taken as a mark. And if we know all the aspects of mark law, they have some concern on some exclusivity access to this expression in some specific mercadotechnical context. And then when the computer animated version of Lion King came into release in 2018, there was also a controversy about the use of this expression as a mark. Next slide, please. Okay, here you have the aspect, because Disney asked to have the Hakuna Matata expression as a mark in the context of clothes and shoes. Not all aspects, because it's another limit of the mark law. Okay, you can try to register, control all aspects of mark, but it has a cost. But then in 2017, next slide, please. An activist from Zimbabwe called Shelton Pala protested against mark because he considered that The register by Disney was an actor in colonialism, and at last, Hakuna Matata, it's a popular expression in many regions and in many countries in the part of southeastern Africa, maybe from Tanzania to Mozambique, and say, no one can register something that haven't created. That it's an interesting aspect, but we are going to see some aspects of use. We can find many aspects of use of cultural heritage in a market context and the registrations as IP and mark. We have many examples in culture and many aspects in the area from some Aboriginal cultures. So, original cultures. So, okay, let's see if we can talk about some kind of robbery, and we can talk about cultural appropriation, that it's another aspect, another issue of this case. Please, lesson slide. Okay, on the one hand, okay, it's a kind of economic exploitation. And also, okay, the expressions have been disseminated by Disney films. The original one of 1994, the series of the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st, and also with the less famous version of 2018. Okay, Disney is using some aspect of the Swahili culture in an economical context. There is an exploitation, an economic exploitation in the area of clothing. But on the other hand, okay, this focus is not a limitation for all the use of the Hakuna Matata expression. And at last, in the use by Disney film, the use is this, it's an object of descontextualization. Let's say, can we talk about cultural appropriation when we only are taking one aspect of the cultural heritage and we don't have all the scenario, all the context to understand the cultural value? I don't think so. But on the other hand, we could talk about the inspiration in a sarcastic way of The Lion King, because there are many similitudes with the original Japanese film, Kimba, the White Lion, made by the genius Osamu Tezuka, one of the fathers of the manga art. But on the other hand, we will talk about an act of colonization that was part of the claim by Mr. Bala. Let's see in this next slide. So, because this has have had in this case an special disrespect for Swahili culture. And why? Because they use the same aspect and the same kind of register in an aspect of the European culture, especially the Germanic Nordic one. Because there is another case, the Loki case, when in Facebook, a person received a strike from Facebook administration because he uploaded a photo of him with a t-shirt with the name Loki, and say, okay, you are attacking a mark by Disney because they register and then again, Disney is using an aspect of traditional culture, in this case, European traditional culture, to try to explode, and in this case, trying to control in a wider expression. Maybe, again, the register is also for closing on shows, and maybe the reason of the strike. But I think in the case of we have some kind of use under the IP law of cultural heritage goods, for example, in this case, linguistical heritage, I think we are experimenting some kind of misuse of mark law. Because in many aspects, all products of Disney factory in classical films came from other cultures, original European, the African, now, for example, from the Pacific and Ocean Islands. Okay. And in any aspects, for example, we can find some aspects where it's not good to use IP law institutions to protect cultural heritage. And in other aspects, for example, and for finishing, I have the aspect in my island Tenerife, a group of folklorists try to recover many of our traditional folklorical songs, part of our musical heritage. But they did using creating some versions and registering them. Okay, it's a derivative word. But then when some people try to replicate and create their own versions or trying to execute the original one, part of cultural heritage, and according with IP law, part of public domain, they discovered that they could be sued by this group of folklorists. So it's a kind of appropriation, very curious, because it's a kind of privatization of cultural heritage for part of the member of the community linked with these cultural heritage traditions. I think I'm at the end of my time. So thank you very much again for the opportunity. And I'm ready for every question, any question you would like to formulate during the part of the debate. Thank you very much. And for my colleagues, dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you so much, Professor Perez, for your fantastic presentation. Also, you brought us to the another aspect of cultural relations and the legal aspects and the practical aspects of how it works sometimes, and why we need to put more consideration into some kind of practical aspects of inter-regional cultural relations. So thank you so much for those cases. Now, finally, I'm moving this time to Professor Uluma. Professor Uluma, yes, a few minutes ago posted some comments. You can just check the festivals that Professor Uluma is going to talk about. So for those who are interested, please go to the chat. Professor Uluma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anita. I need you to confirm that you can hear me because...
Yes, everything is clear, yes.
Oh, great. Thank you. And I appreciate the earlier speakers for already laying the background and to make my own presentation even more easier to understand. Professor Senayon, good to see you after almost 10 years. So this is the kind of thing I will be talking about. It has to take conference like this for us to see ourselves after the first meeting many years ago in Ekiti State in Nigeria. What that tells me is that festivals, create platforms for cultural exchanges, transcultural exchanges, and even at the international level. I'll be speaking on festivals as relational paradigms for negotiating cultural complexities with examples from Nigeria and Germany. Because it may already be known that festivals play a vital role in Nigerian culture, serving as relational paradigms for negotiating cultural complexities. Nigeria is a country of over 300 ethnic nationalities, and all of these diversity gets to be negotiated every day. Different languages, different ways of doing things, different ways of dressing, different ways of viewing even the world that we live together in. And so it's a daily struggle to negotiate identity in Nigeria. And festivals, provide platform for us to understand and appreciate the various cultural backgrounds that we have. And this is also why the Nigerian government also created festivals that basically function to promote this kind of ideal. There is the National Festival of Arts and Culture, NAFEST. There is the Festival of Unity. And these are examples that come handy. There is the Abuja International Carnival, sponsored by government to create a platform where different Nigerian cultural, nationalities come together to negotiate identity and to promote understanding within the country. So in Nigeria, I think it is clear that festivals facilitate dialogue, exchange, and understanding among the diverse ethnic and religious groups that we have in the country. I like to conclude from this vein that it's the same in Germany, because Germany, of course, is also a very diverse country. If you want to look at migration backgrounds, religious inclinations, and even social orientation, things like this, creates diversity that needs also to be negotiated. And I see festivals having platform where this can take place. So today I'm discussing the example of Keisha Festival that is found in Benue State, Central Nigeria, and also the Hildesheimer Wallungen in Germany. I participated in the last edition of the Wallungen last year, 2023. These events, in my understanding, foster inclusivity, reconciliation, and social cohesion in transcultural and, if you like, in international spaces. So the idea is that festivals hold a significant position as cultural mediators, promoting cross-cultural understanding in plural polities like Nigeria and Germany. The Keisha Cultural Festival is an initiative that started in 2015 that was on the basis of fostering reconciliation and coexistence amongst the diverse people that live in Benue State. So political divisions and environmental conflicts, as well as resource-based conflicts between farmers and herders, created serious tensions within the polity that it was difficult to freely interact with people, to socialize with people. There was heightened mutual suspicion. So a group of cultural activists came together to create this festival to foster coexistence, reconciliation, conviviality, peace building, but as well to create a model for sustainable agricultural practices. The festival was founded on a metaphor of food sharing. So among people who are the major ethnic group in Benue State, to share food with one another is a very symbolic, strong symbol of acceptance and the willingness to coexist. So much that if you are invited to a meal and you refuse, even for the good reason that you are already full, that refusal is treated with suspicion, that perhaps you are harboring some ill feeling against the person who invited you, and that's why you were not willing to join in the meal. So it is this kind of very strong cultural idiom that was used to, as a basis for this festival, to create a food sharing occasion where ideal of peace, the ideal of coexistence is promoted, and people can also reflect on the issues of tension within society. It's a multidisciplinary festival featuring dances, puppetry theater, folk songs, indigenous cuisines, costumes, and things like that. At the Hildesheimer Wallungen in 2023, I also happened to be one of the researchers in residence for the International Academy Lab of the festival. And at that time, I worked with students of cultural mediation from the University of Hildesheim to also present food format. So we worked on cuisines from non-Western backgrounds. We had food from the Middle East, we had food from Nigeria, we had food from Brazil, food that was not common, and food that was not European. And we presented this at the festival and invited participants at the festival to join and share in the meals. And we sat down to talk about their experiences, sharing, sharing food from different backgrounds other than theirs. And we were asking questions whether the food experience offered any insights into the cultural backgrounds of places where this food came from. It was also the question whether the participants felt more open after testing the food towards people who come from the backgrounds, that is same as the food. And whether, this food sharing experience was a pathway to opening up further conversations about cultural or social or even political issues in the places where food they shared in came from. Earlier this year, I was also part of a Humboldt residency program in Berlin, and I talked about this experience, and it led us to participate in a project that is in Wedding. It's called Kirchküche, like it's a community kitchen in the African Quarter in Wedding. This is a place where people in the community come together to share meals from different backgrounds and to talk about their issues, and actually to also try to resist gentrification of the Wedding neighborhood. And that day, we also cooked from recipes from Nigeria, from Nepal, and from the Philippines. I was a chef, a guest chef at that day too. And it was my experience that this food sharing also opened up conversations about why people eat the way they do, why people prefer certain foods over others, and whether this kind of fosters certain prejudices or stereotypes about them, and especially those who don't want to eat that kind of food. Does resisting food from another culture, make you feel a certain way about those who eat this kind of food? And so from these experiences with the food component of the Kinshasa Cultural Festival and the food experimentation we did at the Hildesheimer Wahllungen, it was my experience that festivals offer these kinds of platforms. It may be dances, it may be a participatory singing experience or playing an instrument from a different cultural background. But the very idea of participation allows an embodiment that provides the possibility for cultural diplomacy, for people-to-people diplomacy, for economic cooperation and things like that. At the cultural diplomacy level, festivals necessarily facilitate cultural exchanges, promoting mutual understanding and respect. And the questions we're asking about how this food experience made people open towards other cultures, or whether it helped them to reconcile certain prejudices or stereotypes they had about people from this background. And it makes me to the conclusion that yes, festivals have this potency to facilitate this kind of cultural diplomacy. People meeting and interacting at this level would definitely also create friendships, from this kind of individuals connect with one another and understanding background, and also lead economic cooperation and other.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, the voice is I cannot hear very well. Something happened with the yes voice.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now it's fine. Now it's fine. Yes. We couldn't hear just the last sentence. Yes.
What was the last point?
Yeah, last sentence. We just yeah. If you could repeat like the last sentence, does that?
Okay. So I was talking about people-to-people diplomacy. Festivals providing the platform for people to meet one another, connect, understand backgrounds, and even strike friendships. Such friendships could also lead to economic cooperation. For instance, at Kirchküche in Wedding, we were already talking about the possibility to negotiate a future of these cooking from different cultural backgrounds at an international meeting like the Carnival of Cultures in Berlin. At the Kinshasa Cultural Festival experience, there have also been other festivals that have sprung up from these very experience. People meeting there, thinking of other ideas, coming up with their own concepts, and going on with them. So this is where I say festivals offer us this opportunity for cultural relations. Of course, if you meet people and you get to understand them better, or you get to develop respect for them, then conflictual issues that may have been agitating your mind over the years or in your course of hearing about their background and everything might be resolved. It was my experience at the Hilo Summer Balungan last year that we had dancers who came from Ukraine who were very conscious of interacting with people. In fact, they insisted that they will not share changing rooms with people. They will not have other people come into their space, especially people of color. But in the end, after their presentation, and other peoples were also presenting in the corner where we were, it became easier for them to, out of curiosity, ask questions about what that meant or what this food is made of. And the people who came to a festival ground not willing to interact suddenly started interacting with people. This is where I also see the potential for conflict resolution. It might be challenging. I don't think it's the rosy picture of festivals providing us all of this, because like the last speaker mentioned, the question of commercialization. So I think overemphasizing the idea of profit can undermine the potential of festivals and their cultural significance. The idea of cultural appropriation, which can also lead to misrepresentation of cultural practices, can actually exacerbate tensions. There could be logistical challenges and all of that. So I think that despite the challenges, festivals in Nigeria and in Germany offer a unique agency in international cultural relations, promoting cultural understanding, cooperation, and peace. And if you like, we can add that particularly non-Western cultural practices featuring at festivals offer alternative perspectives and challenge dominant Western narratives. It also helps to decenter Western cultural hegemony, promoting diversity and inclusivity. Thank you. And I'm standing by for questions or your valid comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kuma, for your fantastic presentation. Just a small comments from me. I couldn't agree more on the role of the festivals that brings together many cultures. Actually, I took part in some festivals and events organized by the United Nations last years, and they would bring many cultures and food stuff, as you mentioned, and all these dance and all the cultural practices into one place. It was fantastic festival, actually, of integration, respect, knowing each other more. So I couldn't agree more on what you said. Since we do have like 10, 15 minutes for the Q&A session, I see here like question that was asked a couple of minutes ago. So please, for those who would like to ask the question, now is the time to put it on the chat. Now I'm reading the first question I got. The question from Emmanuel Adenei. Many thanks, Professor. I'm reading the question. Many thanks, Professor Olaoluwa, for your presentation. How do we explain remittances from the diaspora to the homeland as a way of taking care of the left behind and addressing the entrapment their exit has caused? Can nostalgia also foster the imaginary of hope in view of the fact those who exit may be a source of wealth creation for their relatives at home? The question is on the chat. Professor Olaoluwa, would you like to answer the question?
Yes, very well. I would like to thank Professor Adeni for that question. Extagia is a theory of intimacy. It is a theory that calls our attention to the affective deficit that results from separation from our loved ones. And in this case, no amount of dollars or euros or pounds can actually take care of that. We are already in the field trying to do some preliminary research on the grant from the University of Iowa, the health faculty. And part of what we have discovered is that there are, for instance, left behind aged parents whose children send them hard currencies, dollars and all. They are materially comfortable, yet they are mentally disturbed, mentally anxious, in fact, mentally unwell. Why? Because the funds being sent home as remittances cannot take care of that affective deficit. Now, is that to say that Extagia is asking whoever has migrated to return home? No. Part of what we are advocating using Extagia is that we now need support systems, structures of support for the left behind. I'll give an illustration. I am not quite aware that there are counseling structures for those about to be left behind or those who have been left behind already. Meaning, in talking, we need to develop, for instance, a new protocol of migration, whereby part of what has to be done before a loved one migrates is that those to be left behind, whether as parents or children or spouses, are taken to professional psychologists and counselors to say, this loved one of yours will go away. Yes, he will be sending you dollars. You will be materially comfortable, but you will, from time to time suffer this form of anxiety or the other precisely because they are not at home. And so this is extremely important. I'll just take one more illustration, just using mental health, for instance. So there is this woman in Ibadan here who is going through treatment right now with a psychiatrist. He's precisely because she has 4 children. 3 of them are already in Europe and America. And the only one left behind in Nigeria is about leaving for Canada, and she can no longer stand that. For a mother who has 3 children abroad, you can imagine the amount of money the children will be sending home. So right now, it is not a matter of being financially comfortable from the remittances. It is a matter of the affective deficit that is created that money cannot address, but that a formal structure of care, the kind of stuff that the Red Cross does for displaced people, the kind of stuff that the UN does for other categories of mobile lives, will be required. And this is part of why I have said that we need to reimagine and reconfigure our understanding of the migration cycle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Olaoluwa. We do have 2 questions to you more, so I'll just briefly read 2 of them, and then you can just answer direct to both. The first question is, I will read the comment from Vakta Zaip. Diaspora contribute to the community's economic and social well-being, and left behind are happy even being apart. My question is, how could then the relationship with diaspora members change over time, if so? Yes, of course, emotional impacts of separation on family dynamics between those abroad and those who stay behind can happen. And the second question, if I may, also to Professor Olaoluwa, thank you for interesting presentation. Does this thesis equate the suffering of the departed with the left behind? How would you answer to both questions, Professor Olaoluwa?
Okay, I hope I can quickly get the hang of the question.
The first is by Vakta Zaip. Maybe you can see in the chat. Yes.
Okay, let me begin with the one that says, does this equate the suffering of the departed with the left behind? Well, there is actually a certain level of semblance between what happens in terms of death and in terms of migration. We'll be talking about the levels of intensity. There is that permanence to death, but we cannot say that it is at the same level, with what happens with migration. For instance, I argue in the theory of extagia that the concept and the experience has the capacity to create a vicious circle of migration. If your dispersed or migrated loved one is in the US, for instance, or in Canada, you can decide to go and pay them a visit. You can do that with death, but there is a sense in which the theory itself, is formulated from a cultural response to dying, precisely because death itself in that context is said to be analogous to migration, to a journey. And that is to that extent. So we cannot metamorphorize, that understanding of it. But certainly, even in general migration studies, right from classical times, we also know that we have always tended to associate, some kind of semblance between death and migration. The first question, let me try quickly read it again. Social well-being. The left behind are happy, even being apart. My question is, how could then their relationship with diaspora members be changed over time? If so, yes, of course, emotional impacts of separation in family dynamics between those abroad. And yes, it is also important to acknowledge the fact that, yes, emotional dynamics change with time, because again, I draw attention back to the formulation of extagia. The left behind don't always remain trapped in the grief of being left behind. They move on. They adopt creative means. And that is exactly what I reference as the simultaneity of grief and creativity. When we take the effigy, the twin effigy among the Ogu, for instance, the effigy is an expression of grief, but carving it itself is also an expression of creativity. So as time goes on, people move on. And that's the kind of stuff that you find in that popular Nollywood film, Osofia in London. When Osofia is finally told that, oh, there is a message from his friend, from his brother, Donatus in London, he said, no, my brother Donatus died a long time ago. Why? Because he said 24 years ago, he went to London, and thereafter, quote him, nobody saw his front, nobody saw his back. And so those at home moved on with their lives. And that is extremely important. How the emotions dwindle or become intensified is also a function of that level of affective maintenance of relations between both categories of the migrated and those in the homeland. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have like two last questions. Due to the limited time, we cannot just have more time for this, but I'll just read the two questions to Professor Perez and Professor Ukuma. I'll ask you for brief answers. Thank you very much for these very interesting presentations. My questions would be the first one: where do you draw the line between the appropriation, exploitation, and inspiration, adoption, melting by and through cultural encounters? And how might Professor Ukuma's phrase, negotiating identities as a social practice as the festivals fit into this? What practices exactly support more fairness in these practices? I saw that Professor Perez had to leave us because due to his classes, but maybe I'll give the floor to Professor Ukuma. And also there's another question, the really last one, to Professor Ukuma as well. Professor Ukuma, thanks for presentation, very interesting. Has there been any moment of culinary conflict between the prejudices, allergies, etc.? So Professor Ukuma, the floor is yours.
So you might wish to say it again?
Yes, the first question is, how might Professor Ukuma's phrase, negotiating identities as a social practice at festivals, fit into this concept of cultural appropriation? Sorry. What practices exactly support more fairness in these practices? Maybe you can refer something to the question. The question is on the chat if you'd like to look at it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I think the question on cultural appropriation speaks for me to the notion of taking without respect, without proper understanding, without reciprocal actions that compensate. If all you've taken for commercial interest, and then compensating the place where this has been taken. And so, if you perhaps from a dominant culture, takes something from less represented cultures and is making a commercial use of it, that becomes appropriation. If it's not used in the proper context, or there is no proper understanding behind the usage, or that it leads to misrepresentation and therefore further stereotyping or further prejudicing on the places where it's taken from, it amounts to appropriation. And I think that actions that involve mutual exchanges, that recognize the cultural significance and context, and even the history where these things are taken, or the cultural practices are so used. And again, actions that fairly attempt to compensate the originators and communities where the practices are taken, can mitigate this form of economic profiteering from those who take them. The other speaker, I think Perez, talked about Disney now having the possibility to sue anyone who tries to use something from a context that they actually took. So it happens that those who are the original creators lack the agency to even press for IP rights, and yet the person who has so used it successfully owns rights to it and begins to profit from it without recourse to the original creators. This is the kind of usage that is problematic. Coming to the question of negotiating identities and whether practices exist as show that explain this concept. I think festivals themselves are sites for cultural exchange, but also have the possibility of the risk of cultural appropriation, where people want to go to the festivals looking in a certain way. We have had celebrities accused of coming to Grammys and other things, that costume that obviously tells of appropriation. I think that if we engage in open dialogue between cultural representatives, and also work on joint decision making and planning in collaborative projects, we will then be showing good practice that helps in representation, that also works towards, that encourages mutual benefit and fair compensation where things are taken. These kinds of dialogue or collaborative endeavors could be workshops or panels, or cultural sensitivity trainings that those who so desire to use practices or aspects of cultures that are not original to them can invest in. And there are also community-led initiatives that empower marginalized communities, that can lead to appropriate cultural exchanges that naturally, from a position of understanding, lets the original owners of such practices know that it is a sharing that is for education and not exploitation. So protocols can be established to guide this kind of respectful, usage or engagement in cultural practices. So, yeah, that's what I can say for now. There was this last question that I
thank you so
did
much.
not get.
Yeah, we had like just one small question about has there been any moment of culinary conflict, maybe from your personal experiences? There's a question on the chat. Maybe any
Yes.
kind of
Yes. Culinary conflict. I do not know to what extent we want to define culinary conflict, but there was this experience we had at the Hildesheim Valungen where the food from Nigeria, people who tasted it always went scharf, 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 sehr scharf. Like it's too spicy, and that also a kind of a challenge for them. They were asking the question, is it the case that people always eat really spicy food? What makes them eat spicy food? Like, we know that Nigerians are interesting, are loud. This kind of stereotypes are that. Is this part of the reason why, they can endure this amount of spice and things like that? These were very interesting questions. And some people actually also, I do not want to profile anyone, but some people were interested in knowing why, not in stating the fact that they cannot, no matter what, try certain foods. They were mentioning issues that pertain to religion and all of that. And in this case, for me, not because the food in itself is problematic, but because of a certain kind of orientation, and in this case, religions, that, creates and deepens these kinds of prejudice. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kuma. I have also a lot of questions, but since we are just after the time, I will just say that I'm so glad that I have the chance to chair this panel. Three examples just showed how international cultural relations are multidimensional and how cultural practices can just bring the platform for exchange and the mutual understanding and appreciation. So it was fantastic to listen to all these presentations. And with just the last final remark, I'm closing the panel and the discussion. I would like to also thanks a lot for our panelists, Professor Senayon Olaoluwa, Professor Shadra Karila Kuma, and Professor Luis Capote Perez. And thank you our audience for joining us for the session and for being the part of the discussion. Lastly, since our panel is the last one, and now we are bringing the ICRRA 2024 conference to a close. On behalf of all guests and panel moderators, I would like to thank you people who made this happen and who worked for several months to organize this event and for constant support we were receiving for last month. I would like to mention especially Clementine Boyfer, Christina Bach, Pedro, Cesar Melo, Evelyn Bloom, and last but not least, Odila Tribal, among others. So huge thank you for us for making this happen and for organizing everything. We hope that all of you, the audience and the guest speakers, you have enjoyed our discussions and that we have given you plenty to think about. There is still many topics, many aspects that we're supposed to bring on the table. So we do hope to do it in the future. I would like to invite you to get to know a little more about the ICRRA network. The link in the chat, I think Pedro just published it. There you will find more details about our members as well as information on the process of becoming the one. You are very warmly welcome to join us. You can also find the latest outcomes of the conference, such as our playlist with videos of all panels. And remember to check our repository where we will be soon publishing our policy brief and the conference proceedings. On behalf of the entire ICRRA network. We thank you very much for your attention, and we hope to see you again at our next conference. Thank you, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Anita. Thank you, Pedro. Good to see you, Clementine. Thank you very much, Professor Shedra. Good to see you again after so long a time. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, everyone.
My pleasure.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.